Hypothalamus is a very small section of the brain. It sits below the thalamus, so that's thalamus and this is the hypothalamus. And as you see, pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus. Recall, hypothalamus is the one that controls the autonomic nervous system, and it is not surprising that hypothalamus is the major link between the nervous system and endocrine system. In this video, I will explain how hypothalamus controls release of a variety of hormones from pituitary gland. But let's first acknowledge that pituitary gland is divided into an anterior portion and a posterior portion. 70% of the weight of pituitary gland is the weight of the anterior, and the rest would be the posterior. So posterior is a smaller part of the pituitary gland. Another difference between anterior and posterior is that in anterior pituitary we do have cells that they actually produce hormone. But in the posterior pituitary, we do not have production of hormones. So posterior does not produce any hormone. However, as I mentioned, from both, hormones are released into bloodstream. So let's explain how this is possible. When we analyze the anterior pituitary, we find 5 groups of cells, and each group releases 1 or 2 major hormones. We have somatotorphic, thyrotrophic, gonadotrophic, prolactin, and corticotrophic cells. Somatotorphic cells that we have in anterior pituitary release the well-known hormone called growth hormone. We know that growth hormone regulates the general growth of the body and also the metabolism. Thyrotrophic cells in anterior pituitary produce thyroid stimulating hormone, and this is the hormone that impacts the thyroid gland, that gland that looks like a butterfly in front of our neck. Basically, the thyroid stimulating hormone that is produced in anterior pituitary regulates the activity and release of hormones from thyroid gland. Gonadotrophic cells that we have in anterior pituitary secrete 2 hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And these hormones travel in bloodstream and they affect the testes of male. We know testes are inside the scrotum. What they do, they stimulate sperm production in testes, also stimulate secretion of testosterone from some cells that we have in testes. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone also impact the ovaries of female. We know that ovaries are located lateral to the uterus inside the pelvic cavity. These 2 hormones stimulate maturation of oocytes, egg cells in the ovaries. Also, they stimulate the ovulation, they stimulate secretion of hormones such as estrogen and progesterone from ovaries. So there are a variety of things that follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones do. But in this video, mostly we focus on their production by gonadotrophic cells that we have in anterior pituitary. Prolactin cells that we have in anterior pituitary secrete a hormone named prolactin. Prolactin is one of the hormones that impact the glandular cells that we have in mammary glands and stimulate these cells to actually produce milk. And corticotrophic cells secrete a hormone named adrenocorticotrpic hormone, or we know it mostly as corticotropine. This is the hormone that stimulates the cortex of adrenal glands, suprarenal glands, and stimulates secretion of cortisol and melanocyte stimulating hormone. Please keep in mind, in separate videos I talk about each one of these hormones individually, but for now I quickly go back to hypothalamus and I notice how hypothalamus controls secretion of the hormones that I just talked about from anterior pituitary. I have secretion of 5 releasing hormones from hypothalamus and 2 inhibiting hormones. For example, it's up to hypothalamus to either stimulate secretion of growth hormone from anterior pituitary or slow down secretion of growth hormone. Same story when it comes to, for example, secretion of prolactin from anterior pituitary. I see that easily hypothalamus is the one that decides whether secretion of prolactin should be stimulated or inhibited. And as you see, there are 3 other releasing hormones that if they're released, obviously the other group of cells in anterior pituitary would be stimulated to secrete their hormones into bloodstream. Now that I have an idea about how secretion of hormones from anterior pituitary is regulated by hypothalamus, I go to posterior pituitary, the one that I emphasize no hormone is produced here. However, in posterior pituitary, we do have secretion of hormones, release of hormones into the bloodstream. So let's see how this is possible. First, in this simple image, I notice that I do have some cells in hypothalamus. We call them neurosecretory cells. And we have 2 groups. One group produces a hormone named antidiuretic hormone, and another group produces a hormone named oxytocin. And then these cells that actually produce the hormones, through their long processes, send the hormones to their axon terminals. And inside the axon terminals, they pack ADH or oxytocin inside some vesicles and store them here in the posterior pituitary. When we have a proper stimulation of the hypothalamus, which we'll learn what are the stimuli in other videos, then hypothalamus, the cells that we have, release the hormones from their axon terminal into the network of blood vessels that we have in the posterior pituitary. So that's why we say that production of oxytocin and ADH would be actually by the cells that we have in hypothalamus. However, these hormones are released into bloodstream in the posterior of pituitary gland. And later, I explained that, for example, antidiuretic hormone impacts kidneys. It also has effect on especially the arterioles that we have in skin and abdominal viscera. And one main goal that ADH has is to increase the blood pressure. Oxytocin, however, in bloodstream travels, for example, to the uterus to stimulate muscle contraction here, for example, to help delivering the baby. Also, oxytocin travels to the mammary glands and stimulates ejection of milk out of the mammary glands when the time comes.